Welcome to episode 166 of the Half Point Per Podcast. I'm your host, Evan Riggs, joined as always by my co-host, Dalton Willie. No Johnny today. Dalton, how are you doing on New Year's Day, 2025? It's only fitting that we start 2025 off with a way too early 2025 top 12, which we will get to, but National Hangover Day. We've somehow made it 2:00 pod. Work today. How you doing?
I'm feeling great. I've already won Best Ball Mania 6 in my mind, and I've already made all of the right calls, learning from my lessons.
Your tweet that was none of my priors are wrong, all the coaches were wrong about your best ball teams not advancing was pretty good. That was pretty good. I'll give props for that one.
It is a factual point. Davian Wicks was a league winner, and anybody who says otherwise can eat it. So pretty happy about that. Already have Kyle Pitts penciled in at tight end 14 going into the 2025 season because he's done it 2 years in a row. So we're not going to screw this one up.
Just a monster week 17 from Kyle Pitts to propel himself up to tight end 14.
It's like he knows.
That is where champions are made.
That is right there. If you were starting Kyle Pitts in your championship final, I would like to see the rest of your roster.
Real quick, we don't do the talk about our teams thing very much. I just want to take like 10 seconds to congratulate myself for winning the title in our league. Real big for me. Want to take the chance to also just like let people know, I know there may be times like what happened to me 2 weeks ago when Jalen Hurts gets injured and you think you're going to lose your semifinal because of it. A lot of people probably did, where you think I'm done with this. Like, why do I play fantasy football? It hates me. I hate it. Why do I do this? But just remember, when you win your league, it's all worth it. And I promise you, one day, if it hasn't happened for you, you will win your league. Just make smart moves year over year. It's all you can do. I mean, I've got to say, my team put up a 180 spot in a half point, 1 QB on a bye. So that was the highest score in our league's history, which will not count, which is a little bit sad. But then my team did have the 2 highest scoring playoff performances in our league's history, one of which basically without a quarterback. So just want to take a second, congratulate myself, pat my team on the back. Really, really a job well done by all those lads for the mighty.
Yeah, really good for the brand. For anybody listening, that is 3 of the 4 years Evan and I have won that league. So yeah. Maybe sometimes we know what we're talking about just on occasion.
Yeah. We'll get to that down the road. I think we had some pretty good calls this year. Both just real football and fantasy football. Obviously, I am 1 Lions away from cashing. Lions went away from cashing that plus 2,600 Chiefs and Lions #1 seeds in each of their conferences. So if that happens on top of winning the league, and I actually bet real money on that too, that will just be electric. But before we get into our top 12, Dalton, I did just have a couple of things I wanted to talk about. I couldn't really think of a creative segment or way to do this other than just like, let's just call these our say what stats. Just that'll make you say what. That might surprise you a little bit before we get too far away from this season and really start looking ahead the next season. And naturally, the first place I'm going to start, because you brought him up in our group chat, or maybe I brought him up. He got brought up this morning in our chat. Is Chris Olave, who, looking around at top 12s, he's nowhere to be seen, which is a little bit hurtful. No, I'm just kidding. He doesn't belong in the top 12s. But I do think, like, you sent me those dynasty wide receiver ranks the other day. I think he was 24th.
He was.
I think a year ago at this time, I don't think you probably could have found Olave below like 15. And in most, he would have been somewhere between like 8 to 15, I would say, is kind of the range that he lived in. And this is a guy who this year, his say what stat is he actually scored in double digits in 4 of his 6 complete games, like start to finish games that he played. He obviously got knocked out of 2 games, got concussed and knocked out early twice, one of which he had negative points in the game, -1 points, because I believe he fumbled on the play that he got concussed. So ended up with 1 catch, 1 concussion, -1 points.
You don't play in half point per concussion leagues.
Olave would have had a couple of slightly better days. His average points per game this year was basically right at 10. That is because he had 2 games with basically exactly 2 points. But he also, like I said, had 4 games with more than 10 points. And it is actually kind of funny. His highest scoring game was, I think, at Dallas. He had 18 points. He had a touchdown in that game. But his best game, 8 for 107 with 14 targets. That was the only game he played without Derek Carr at quarterback, start to finish this year. So just a little food for thought as we think about Chris Olave for next year. I also just learned today that he might play Week 18. Which why? Like what? He and Alvin Kamara both want to play and might play. It's like, hello, guy. Like you want to lose. This guy's had 2 concussions and like very close together this year. You want to lose. What? I don't know. But Chris Olave, I'm already predicted to you yesterday he's going to be the Matt Waldman dented can of the next 6 months, talking about underrated dynasty guys.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough for Chris Olave because there's so many unsures with New Orleans, and it's just obvious that there's a lot of talent issues on that team.
Yeah.
Behind him and Shaheed, there's really nobody on that team who was worth anything at wide receiver. MVS made a weird appearance because they were so low. And Derek Carr seems to like sending his wide receivers to the shadow realm with the way he throws the ball. And I don't know if it looks like he'll be the quarterback again for them next year.
Maybe.
So Chris Olave is one of those Terry McLaurin types where we know he's really good. We're just really waiting for the time for him to be really good.
Yeah, I'll be curious what his actual ADP is next year because it probably got a little bit too high this year, even for as much as I love Olave. With that said, usually what happens with these kinds of things, it gets too high and then it goes way too low when the guy has a disappointing year for one reason or another. So he'll be one to follow. And even with 4 double-digit games in 6 complete games, if you think back to how we were thinking about the Saints and Chris Olave, it was like Rashid Shaheed has every deep touchdown for this team this year. Olave is going to get some. So there was some, I think, regression coming for Olave in that regard if he kept playing, which he did not. So I think he was doing what he was doing. And there were probably still better days ahead, or more consistent days ahead, at least for him. So he'll be one to monitor. A guy that I think fits that exact mold of maybe, I don't even know if he got overrated, but like hits kind of the apex of his value, has a bad year, and then is way too low heading into this year. And now this year had a fantastic year. Is T. Higgins. Is T. Higgins. Did you know, Dalton, he averaged 16.2 fantasy points per game this year? That's a career high. His previous career high was 13. And think about it. T. Higgins is a guy who, in multiple years before this most recent draft cycle, he's kind of been penciled in as somewhere between the wide receiver 12 and 16 and just a very safe, high-end wide receiver 2. And he was a lot better than that this year. And the thing about T. Higgins, if you have him, you're going to get the push notification on Friday about once every 2 weeks. That's going to give you major heartburn. Maybe he'll play, maybe he won't. But the great thing about him is he missed 5 games this year. So either he's great or he's just not out there and gives you the chance to actually start somebody else. He only had 2 games where he really killed you. He had one with 3.3 points, one, I think, with like 5 point something. Every other game was 9.9 and above. So this was T. Higgins' best year as a pro. And I think we should be rooting for him to go back to Cincy. Whereas maybe a year ago, people were kind of hoping, okay, let's get him out of there. Let's get him to be a wide receiver 1 in another offense and kind of see what he can do. But I don't think it can get much. I mean, 16.2 points per game. That's more than Amon-Ra St. Brown averaged, who was the wide receiver 3 this year.
Yeah, I think it's a wide receiver 2 average, right below Justin Jefferson. It's going to be a interesting offseason on if the Bengals can retain him. And more importantly, if he ends up somewhere else, we've learned in the last couple of years, especially with wide receivers, it can get worse going to a new team. And it often does get worse, especially with a skill set like T. Higgins, where you need that elite caliber quarterback who's willing to fit the needle in the pocket and gives you him the chance to win some of those jump balls. It's not that he doesn't separate, but he is one of the apex jump ball winners in the NFL. So
think about how many times you see T. Higgins, this is for the YouTube audience here, make this exact catch where he reaches straight out, catches it, and then holds the ball in one hand as he's getting tackled at like by the sideline. Like that's kind of the signature T. Higgins play in my mind.
Yeah, and that's definitely not going to fly with some of the lower tier quarterbacks in the NFL because they're not effective enough at reading coverages to trust their guys.
You brought up Dontavian Wicks earlier. I wanted to take a quick look at one of his teammates, Jayden Reed. I have no joy in talking about Jayden Reed the way I'm about to today because I think he's a great player. Did you know that Jayden Reed had a 17% target share this year? That is tied. Listen to some of these names. That's tied with Xavier Worthy, Xavier Legette, and Noah Brown. I mean, he was the wide receiver 25 this year. I hate to do the like take this away, but I'm going to take away week 1 where he had the mega explosion game, and he's down to wide receiver 34. And then if you want to really narrow it down, let's just look at weeks 12 through 17. Like those are the money weeks in fantasy football. That's the end of your regular season, and that's the playoffs. He was the wide receiver 52 over that 5-week stretch. And it's just a really tough way to live, getting the volume that he gets. This is just a rare case where I don't think this is really at the feet of the player. I just think this is just the situation that he's in kind of at this point. I mean, the Packers have Romeo Doubs is 20% target share. That leads the team. And that's a pretty low number to be leading a team in the NFL. He's second with 17%. And then Dontavian Wicks was 16%. I don't remember Christian Watson off the top of my head, but it was in that neighborhood. So what we talked about a lot before the season about just those receivers and not really knowing, we think Jayden Reed's the best one. I still think he's the best one. He doesn't get treated like the best one, though. And it's just a really tough ride for fantasy because there are a lot of single-digit games mixed in there with, a boom every 4 or 5 weeks or so.
Yeah, what we expected with the Packers offense didn't happen, which was 2 wide receivers becoming the 2 target getters in that offense. Instead, everybody cannibalized each other, including Tucker Kraft and Josh Jacobs, inching up there in their target shares.
My guy, Josh Jacobs, first career touchdown reception this year.
7 years in the NFL. But it's been pretty poor, and it's going to be another interesting offseason, especially if the Packers add any other mouths to feed in that offense, which is certainly possible to do. Romeo Doubs also, I regret to inform everybody listening, he did get better this year. He became a better player. I think myself included, a lot of people expected him to regress and lose out. He did not. He was their most consistent fantasy scorer. He was not their most explosive fantasy scorer. And Dontavian Wicks is second in the league in drops for anybody interested in that. The guy can separate like no other if only he knew how to catch a football. And I would be doing this podcast from Maui because of the amount of money I've invested in him as a player.
Okay, 2 positive ones to close us out here, and these will be a little bit quicker. Just wanted to, because I did listen to, I don't know if it, not a top 12, but just I heard a top 12 quarterback conversation, and I didn't even hear the name Patrick Mahomes brought up in this top 12 conversation. Just want to remind people. So weeks 8 through 17, week 8 being the first week that DeAndre Hopkins played with the team, Patrick Mahomes averaged 20.3 fantasy points per game. That's good for quarterback 8. And obviously, very, very, very small sample size this year, but that's what we have to work with. If you look at the last 2 weeks of the season, which are the only 2 weeks that you had Hollywood, Worthy, and D-Hop, who should have been Rashee Rice, but wasn't. But the only 3 weeks you had a real top 3 receiver group for the Chiefs. He averaged 25 points per game. So I'm not saying he should be quarterback 1, 2, 3, even 4. Just don't forget about him as like the QB 6, 7, 8 next year, because he does not have the Josh Allen 50-point games like Lamar Jackson 50-point games. He doesn't do that really anymore. But he's been really consistent down the stretch this season, and then has had 2 really nice games with his actual real weapons at receiver the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, and this will be interesting to watch. Patrick Mahomes has taken the most sacks he has in his career this season, and depending on how the draft goes and the offseason goes, the Chiefs look pretty poised to be fixing the tackle spots. The inside of
God,
that
I
line
hope
is
so.
the best in the NFL with Joe Tootie when he's not playing left tackle, Creed Humphrey, and Trey Smith. So if they shore up the protections for that team, and then that team next year looks to be rolling with, at a minimum, Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy, I feel like Mahomes is going to be at a discounted price again. And like Evan said, just a reminder to take that to one step further. Week 17 against the Steelers was the first week that Hollywood Brown played more than 20% of the team's snaps, and Mahomes went off for 3 touchdowns and 300 yards against a defense that has not been like a bottom tier defense in the NFL. The Steelers at home against the Steelers in a road game with 5 days of rest with their starting left guard playing left tackle. So there's certainly a lot on the bone for Patrick Mahomes in this next year. And I'm sure the Chiefs are going to shore up the tackle situation, and wouldn't be surprised if one of D-Hop or Hollywood Brown returned to Kansas City.
Which would you rather? Like, if you're I say if you're a Chiefs fan, you're a Chiefs fan. We're Chiefs fans. Which would you rather be back in KC next year of those two, if you have to pick one?
Hollywood Brown. There's just concerns for me with D-Hop's age. What he does is really good, but Rashee Rice does a lot of what late career D-Hop already does, but with a little more explosiveness at this point.
Yeah, I agree. I would love both guys back, though. D-Hop made a lot of money, man. How about you just stay in a spot that makes you happy, because you've been so miserable in so many different places throughout your career. Why don't you just stay in Kansas City? Last one. Bucky Irving had 1,430 total yards this year on 44% of his team's touches. Really no notes on top of that. Or 44% of his team's snaps, excuse me, not touches. Snaps. 44% of his team snaps. No further notes. Bucky Irving's awesome. He's not in my top 12 that we'll get to, but I did at least the thought crossed my mind.
We'll be in an interesting spot to see what Liam Cohen does, the offensive coordinator for the Bucs, who's done a very good job. Seems to me, based on Twitter, a lot of Bucs Twitter is insinuating, should he leave, he should just become the head coach. But that always changes a lot of things when the offensive coordinator becomes head coach. And obviously Todd Bowles has done a lot of good for that team. Mm-hmm. Best shot here for me would be him staying one more season as the offensive coordinator. And we know we have a really good team. And then like an offshoot of it, I know he's not in the talks. I really feel like Baker Mayfield should be in the MVP discussion, doing what he did.
Yeah, well, I said this to somebody the other day. Sam Darnold would be at the top of conversations if
his name wasn't Sam Darnold.
If his name wasn't Sam Darnold, yeah. If he didn't have the game where he's mic'd up saying, "I'm seeing ghosts out there."
Yes. And just a reminder to everybody, Baker Mayfield did play 5 games without both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, and the Bucs went 4-1 in those games, and he threw for over 280 yards in every one of those games. So pretty impeccable player. Probably going to be like a top 8 quarterback, I'm going to assume, for me in the upcoming season. But I'm really excited about the resurgent careers of some of these older quarterbacks who, for one reason or another, didn't get a shot.
Yeah, all of a sudden you look at that 2018 draft, it's Josh Allen, it's Lamar Jackson, and Sam Darnold, it's Baker Mayfield. It's like, holy crap. That's a really good. And then there's, did you see the tweet? It's like Josh Rosen, his LinkedIn. He's like,
he's an MBA at Wharton.
So the whole draft class really doing some big time stuff. But
the guy cockier than Baker Mayfield didn't make it, which is hilarious.
On Bucky Irving, I will be curious to see not how this impacts his value, because I think it'd have to be somebody really good to impact his value. But what happens behind him in that running back room? Is it still Rachaad White and Sean Tucker? Do they add somebody else, and Rachaad White and Sean Tucker both kind of become irrelevant? Are those guys both on the team like that? I think there's room for growth behind Bucky Irving on the depth chart. But this is a good reminder that if they have an RB2 that you feel better about this year or next year than this year, he only had 44% of the snaps played this year and still had almost 1,500 yards. So really good player, really fun player. Looking forward to what he does next year. And with that said, Dalton, without further ado, let's jump right into the top 12. Do you want to start at 12, go up, or 1 and go down?
Well, I'll start at 12 and go up. We'll save I think everybody knows who 1 is, but I think you and I might have some disagreements near the top here.
I'm actually not sure if everyone knows who 1. I haven't looked around like you, so I'll be curious.
If it's not the player that I have at 1, I will have Actually, he wasn't one in a lot of places, but he's one for me.
Okay, so I think there's questions, but we can save that for last then. Let's start with 12, and you can go first since I've talked more with these 5 guys here.
At 12, I have Breece Hall, and I'll just start off by saying this is a spot that's likely he's going to move up in my rankings rather than down. There's just so much uncertainty in that entire organization. So starting from the top, we don't know who the GM is going to be. They were making moves based on Madden ratings. Don't love to hear that. Head coach, we don't know who the head coach is going to be. Quarterback, we don't know who the quarterback is going to be. Offensive line, there are 3 linemen on this team that are 34 years or older. 2 of them I don't think will be in the NFL next year. They do have their first-round draft pick at offensive guard who can move around. So just questions top to bottom about who's leading this team in a variety of ways.
Well, have you? I checked something real quick, so I zoned out for like 3 seconds. You didn't say Aaron Rodgers' name yet, did you?
Well, we don't know who the quarterback is going to be.
Yeah, so it could be Aaron Rodgers. Maybe Garrett Wilson actually does ask out if that does happen, like reports.
And no Devontae Adams. Devontae Adams is set to be a free agent this offseason.
But if Rodgers comes back, it may be Rodgers, Adams, no Garrett Wilson, whatever.
Their backup quarterback is the former quarterback for Florida State from a year ago who didn't play in their playoff game notoriously. Outside of that, there is some QB reshuffling going around. I mean, Sam Darnold will be a free agent. I don't think New York's doing that again, but Kirk Cousins is likely going to be on the move based on what it's looking like in Atlanta. Who knows about the Derek Carr situation?
If one quarterback who's old coming off an Achilles doesn't work, why not try another?
Get the next one. So there's just so much up in the air with this Jets team that I can't rank Hall any higher. And the fact that he's in my top 12 is just such a testament to how good of a player he really is. Yeah. Because the Jets franchise is on fire and he still warrants that top 12 consideration because we know even when they're at their lowest 2 years ago, he is a league winning running back. And even this year, despite some of the bumps and the nicks and the Braylon Allens, he was a top 6 running back in the NFL. And he continues to produce in terrible environments. If they get one good environment, we could be seeing an entirely different Breece Hall conversation.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it really is just like a tip of the cap to how talented the player is because this year, despite missing just one game, he's the RB 18. That's just a disaster. And I pushed back a little bit earlier in the season on people freaking out about Breece Hall, and I still think it was like with what his performances at that time, it justified light disappointment, not complete freak out. He got into the playoffs. Probably like if you had him, he didn't make you miss the playoffs. But once you got there, 12-12-6 was what he put up for you. So he did not do what you drafted him to do, obviously, to help you win your league. And this is one that will just really depend on what the Jets look like in 4 months. Who's the quarterback? Like, what's the O-line look like? How's the receiver room shaken out? Partially based on who the quarterback is. Like, can we just have function with Breece Hall? I have him at 11, so we're thinking along the same vein there. 12 for me is Derrick Henry, and you may have him higher. I had Joe Mixon here, and I told you I was really fighting between Mixon and Derrick Henry at 12. And I feel like you really have something to say right now.
Derrick Henry just didn't even make my honorable mentions.
Are you serious? Wow. Yeah. I mean, I get it because it's all the things that I was concerned about before the season. But also, like, we made this drop how many years ago? 4 years ago?
When Derrick Henry's outside of the top 20, I want you each to rue this day.
Yeah, we'll clip this. We'll clip this whole thing. We'll make it into a whole video.
And he just
keeps rue the day at some point.
He keeps doing it. He's made both you and I in separate years rue the day for. I don't even want to say I was doubting him because I was close to ADP. You were above ADP, and yet he still made me at least look like a big idiot for being too low on him. And this is obviously he has to still be in Baltimore for this rank. He probably will be. They do have an out. In his contract, he counts $11 million against the cap this year, $3.9 million in dead money if he's cut, $7 million saved against the cap. But if you do that, like what are you doing at running back for $7 million? Like, it's going to be worse, and you're not saving that. Like, what might happen is he may get an extension and renegotiate a little bit to bring that number down a little bit. But like, I know all the age, all the workload consideration, like all of that. It's just, I think I have to just keep ranking him until he doesn't do it.
Yeah, and my argument, part of it is going to be like projecting forward, and then part of it is going to be this Ravens offense. So projecting forward, if you haven't started looking at the 2025 rookie draft class, it is by far the most loaded draft class for running back we've had in a long time. I think most people are in agreement on that. And I think the Ravens take a running back at some point, knowing that they need a future here. Justice Hill has been their perennial future. He did take Derrick Henry significantly off the field. And
I still like Keaton Mitchell for whatever it's worth. I still like good. Keaton Mitchell.
Rashid Ali basically missed the entire season, but he's another running back. He was out of Marshall. It was his rookie year that I do like. But if they take a running back in the top 5 rounds, I think that's somebody that's going to start to look at taking some of Henry's workload. I'm probably going to end up ranking him around like pick 16 through 18, where I feel comfortable. Age 31 will be his start for the 2025 season, which is a concern. And this Ravens offense really seems to have figured out that their pass first offense with run as a secondary option. And he did do a lot of what he did on his touchdown margin, and his touchdown margin is significantly different than Saquon Barkley's. So I pulled this because Saquon Barkley is obviously in my top 12. Saquon Barkley had 6 of his 13 rushing touchdowns from outside the 20. Derrick Henry had 1. So there are so many ways that Derrick Henry can go wrong, and you're just making a really high leverage bet on him with your first round pick. When, in my opinion, the guys I have in my top 12 are younger and still have more to give. And we know what Derrick Henry has to give, and we would have to see a real outlier season, which he's already done multiple times again, for him to really hit home.
No, I know. So who's 11 for you?
11 for me is Devon Achane. So
okay, he's in. I'd say Achane is either 13 or 14 for me. He's one of my first 1 or 2 left out.
So the entire Miami offense had a weird season. Just a side note, did a lot of like reading of people's mock drafts, and I didn't see Tyreek Hill in like the top 3 rounds for most people, which I found really surprising.
Yeah, that's probably going to be a hate's gone too far situation.
Yeah,
like you should take Tyreek Hill in your late 2nd, early 3rd round if you're at the 2-3 turn.
Absolutely. But the season for the Miami Dolphins was incredibly weird. Before Tua's injury, Devon Achane was pacing to be the RB1 overall. In spite of that, he still finished relatively high. He also had 78 receptions, which is 10 more than Alvin Kamara, who had the 2nd most, and 19 more than Bijan, who had the 3rd most. And he was split out wide on snaps 42% of the time in the slot. So he is kind of the premier dual threat quarterback or running back, other than one other player I'll talk about higher in these ranks. And I do trust another season removed, Mike McDaniel's going to get this offense engineered to at least start off hot again, and that they're going to come back. I mean, despite everything and the season that the Miami Dolphins have had, they still have a shot at the playoffs. It's just been a really strange season for Miami all around. And Devon Achane definitely was one of the people negatively impacted from that. In quarterback starts with players not named Tua Tagovailoa, Devon Achane was the RB16. In starts with Tua Tagovailoa, he would have been the RB3 in points per game. So
and I don't have the splits, but I know specifically the receptions were were very different with and without Tua.
Yes, and that's where he made all of his money. And so especially in half PPR and PPR, I like Achane in the first round. And he didn't really have any like back-to-back really big explosive games like he had his rookie season. And I don't think he's lost a step there. I really just think it was a matter of how condensed that offense had to become among Tua's injuries and the backup quarterback play.
We did get a comment, but no one who roasted T. Rash Higgins made it to the fantasy playoffs, let alone the championship. Buddy, he started in my semifinals and my final and was my finals MVP. So beg to differ there. My team was number 1 seed overall, by the way.
Also, the team that won Best Ball Mania 5 had T. Higgins on it.
Yeah, so T. Higgins pretty valuable. All right, we've said my 12 and 11. My 10, who I heard from sources, is not on your list. Brian Thomas Jr. It's shocking to me that I'm the one that has him and you don't.
That is funny. My 10, just get it out now because this is a debate I had, is Malik Neighbors.
Yeah,
So,
he's not on mine. He's not on mine, and he's not in my honorable mentions either.
So Brian Thomas Jr. is an honorable mention for me. I'll let you talk about him, and then I'll talk about why I put Neighbors over him.
So it's funny because like the Jags were just an unmitigated disaster this year. Like with Trevor Lawrence, without Trevor Lawrence, they were so bad. Travis Etienne, because of that partially, and because of Tank partially, was just unusable this year after being a top 2-3 round pick. And it wasn't like Tank Bigsby turned into a star, and that's what happened. It's like, nope, just couldn't overcome the situation. Doesn't matter if it's Trevor Lawrence with 2 shoulders, 1 shoulder. Doesn't matter if it's Mac Jones, who I would say is like on par with the worst quarterback situation in the NFL. Mac Jones, probably. Brian Thomas Jr. just produced, no matter who was at quarterback this year. And I have to think, whether it's Lawrence or injuries or whatever next year, maybe new coach, we'll see. I have to think it's going to be at least a little bit of a better environment, offensive environment for them next year. He was the wide receiver 4. He played banged up for a stretch this season too. 14.2 points per game. He had 3 consecutive 20-point or more games to close out the season. And he was in double digits 12 times this year. Jamar Chase did that 12 times. Justin Jefferson did it 14 times. He's the only one who did it more than Brian Thomas Jr. this year. Amon-Ra St. Brown, who we've put up there as the model of consistency in fantasy football. And that was a little less true this year because of Jameson Williams, because of just the nature of the Lions being so good they could blow people out all year for the most part. But he had 11. He still had one less than Brian Thomas Jr. Tyreek Hill, who you mentioned, had 9. A.J. Brown had 9. He missed 3 games. Best he could have done is 12. And then what's interesting to think about, Garrett Wilson in 2023 had 9. I think he had the same this year. But think about where we elevated Garrett Wilson after 2023. He had 9 such games. He had never even reached 16 points the whole year. Never had 16 points in a game. I don't think what the Jags had was that much worse than what the Jets had at quarterback this year. And think about where he got elevated to because he got Aaron Rodgers coming off a torn Achilles. Like, Trevor Lawrence can be better than that next year. I didn't go into this expecting to put Brian Thomas Jr. here, but I just couldn't really deny what he's done and what I think he's going to do next season.
Yeah, and to anybody listening who doesn't know why this is funny, I own Brian Thomas Jr. in our Dynasty League, and I've been a pretty heavy tout of Brian Thomas Jr. Really, the hair splitter for me on him versus Malik Neighbors, the first thing I'll say is if you look at Brian Thomas Jr., if you don't remember, in week 8, he had a chest injury that it was first reported he was going to go on IR. He didn't go on IR. He had back-to-back games with like 1.9 points and like 5 points, had really poor games. If you take out the time that I'm very likely assuming he was injured, Brian Thomas Jr. Puts up an even more stellar season in points per game metrics. Great player. I am just really confused about the future of Jacksonville. It seems that people are saying Ben Johnson is already a done deal there.
Yeah, but like
that would change things dramatically for a lot of reasons. But
yeah, that's what. But like, I think this year is about as bad as it can get, and he was already this good. I'm not saying he's going to be wide receiver 1 next year if it gets better, but like he just was so good in such a bad spot this year that it's just hard for me not to put him inside the top 12.
Well, part of the benefit was Kirk and Davis injuries that gave him more playing time, and it showed he's better than both of them.
Yeah.
But those are, and again, he's an honorable mention for me. And really, the reason I put Malik Neighbors in over this is because despite how bad Jacksonville was, the Giants were worse. Malik Neighbors went on to miss 3 NFL games. He still put up 1,000 yards, 5 touchdowns. He had 4 different quarterbacks, and it was the NFL's 29th scoring offense. So I really, and his uncharted on-target throw rate was the 3rd worst among NFL starters. So
the thing for me is like, how's it get much better next year? what's the path to like the path for Jacksonville is we get a good Trevor Lawrence season next
Kirk
year,
Cousins.
which we've seen. I mean, Kirk Cousins got benched in Atlanta this year. Like,
I know Kirk Cousins is better than Daniel Jones. But the other half of this argument is, despite how much I love Brian Thomas Jr. and I do love him, I do think Malik Neighbors is still a better player. And until Jacksonville doesn't Jacksonville, I won't believe it. But New York's going to continue to New York. Again, these two were both in running for my top 12. I went down with Malik Neighbors because there are so many plays when you go back and watch some of his games where you're like, that's an 80-yard touchdown if they just look at him. And he's so open so often. And not that Brian Thomas Jr. doesn't have a ton of those as well, but I do think they are the best two rookies out of this draft class, which was not consensus coming into the season.
Yeah. I think right now that's the case. I want to give it another year. I know, obviously, we have to make statements like that because we are doing rankings and things like that. But just long term for me, I still want to give Rome Odunze and Marvin Harrison Jr. I think was, I think he's gone from being propped up as generational to kind of unfairly criticized this year. Like it's kind of crazy how quickly that has turned, but let's just see what happens with both.
If you go, I went back and listened. If you go back and listen to our wide receiver reg show, you and I both say we feel like he's going to end it in the top 36. He finishes wide receiver 34, and we would be happy if that happened and that he was being taken too early for the player he is. So it is pretty funny. And there is a ton of criticism around him that I don't think all of it is well deserved.
Yeah. Okay. Number 9 for me. We can be quick on this one. I have Amon-Ra St. Brown. Like I said, not as consistent as the last few years. Very little to do with him. Mostly to do with, like I said, Jameson Williams coming into his own this year. Obviously, they still have Sam Laporta. They have other guys like Khalif Raymond, Tim Patrick, who get the ball as well. And then the fact that they have just pummeled teams this year. And when they pummel teams, they will run the ball 40 times in the game and just run you over. He did score career high touchdowns this season, but I think you kind of take that outlier and you take the outlier of it's really hard to go like 15-2 back-to-back years and be this dominant. The Lions probably won't be this dominant while still being a pretty good offense next year, would be my guess. And he probably won't score this many touchdowns again next year. Take all that, and I think you probably get a bottom half of the first round kind of value for Amon-Ra next year, who is still as safe as it gets, I think, in fantasy football.
Yeah, and he's my 8, so I'm right up there with you. There's nothing I can really say that's detrimental to him. He is the most consistent fantasy player right now. He was second in the NFL in receptions, second in the NFL in touchdowns. Really one of the safest picks you can ask for, and one of the few players that never shows up on the injury report, but you find out later was playing with 6 different injuries the entire time and still.
Yeah, I'll never forget the Netflix, the receiver, where it's like, oh, he was playing with hand and foot disease. He was playing like,
yeah.
And then there was a game, I think this year, where it was like, oh, he threw up. He said on his podcast, he threw up for the first time in his life 24 hours before the game and went out and had like 100 yards or
He's
something.
He's the inverse of T. Higgins.
Yeah, no, he truly is. And then like even this year, you'll get the press conference after like 2-3 weeks where it's like, yeah, I think he's kind of limping out there a little bit, but he's playing and he's fine. You'll get Dan Campbell like, yeah, Saint's a little banged up right now, but it's like, oh, okay. Tough as nails, always out there when he can be, just very, very safe and just a really, really fun player to watch.
Yeah. So at 9 for me, I have Nico Collins, who I pulled this stat from Davis Maddock on Twitter. Nico Collins is the first player that he could find in NFL history since they charted plays drawn back from a flag to lose 5 80-yard touchdowns on penalty markers.
Yeah, so I have just to get ahead. I have Nico at 13. He's my first one left out.
I think that's perfectly fair, and I'll talk about a little bit of my concern with him. He is 6th in the wide receiver points per game. He missed 4 games with a hamstring injury. Next year, there are a lot of questions I have about Houston. Yeah. I mean, they're kind of limping into the playoffs right now.
31-2. Yeah.
Yes. And I know for a fact next year Nico will be the uncontested alpha, and him and CJ Stroud have that connection I look for in my first round wide receiver picks. Like there are so many plays where Stroud is like halfway on the ground already, and he gets the ball out to Nico for like a pickup on third down, which is really fun to watch. I do want more bodies in this room, and then I do want Nate Tice pointed this out on Twitter, and I really agree with it. CJ Stroud still isn't allowed to call protections at the line of scrimmage, which could explain a lot of the issues they're having. I really expect in year three.
It's kind of that Sam Fran, Brock Purdy thing a little bit. Obviously, not an offensive coach from Sam Fran, but from the Sam Fran coaching tree.
Yeah, well, and Bobby Slowick is from the San Fran coaching tree. And then I would like to see the Houston Texans were second in the NFL in first down run rate. It's something that I really think has to change for them to go back to being an explosive offense. And then just a little pat on the shoulder for me, even though I'm talking about how good Nico Collins is. I pointed out in the offseason that CJ Stroud saw the least amount of cover 2 in the NFL in his rookie season. This year, he's seen the 4th most, and his numbers have definitely been impacted by the usage of cover 2 on him. But Nico Collins has become one of the best wide receivers, and a case
I also think that that is kind of why they brought in Stephon Diggs, and then he just got taken out of the offense. So that is part of the struggle probably against.
And up until the Chiefs game, Diggs was still outscoring Tank Dell.
Yeah.
Not a big game there till he got injured, but Diggs did give them that underneath option that they were looking for. And with the injuries they've had, I mean, it's been difficult for that offense, but I expect them to add somebody to that room, maybe 2 people to that room, and figure things out for next year.
Yeah. I really have no qualms with Nico. Like I said, I haven't 13 thought about him pretty heavily. Just felt nauseous about leaving either Derrick Henry or Breece Hall off, and that was kind of the group of 3 with Joe Mixon as the 4th that I was really thinking about there. And I will be interested because Stephon Diggs, I'm assuming, probably won't be back, or if he is back, who knows when he's playing again and what he looks like at this point. Tank Dell, no idea when he's going to be back. I don't really feel like we still know the full extent of the knee damage. We just know it's bad. So what happens at receiver? Obviously, Nico's going to be the one. You love that, and he's great. You need the offense to be more consistent and moving the ball up and down the field to give him more opportunities, though. And that's kind of what I worry about a little bit with the Texans next year. At number 8, to the surprise of absolutely nobody, I have Josh Jacobs. And again, this is with the caveat he's on the Packers next year, because he did sign, I think it was a 4-year deal, but it was a very fake 4-year deal. And they do have an out after this year if they want it, for about $9.4 million in dead cap. His cap hit goes from 11 to 15 to 17 the next 3 years, with the way the contract is currently now. But for the sake of this, we just have to kind of assume he's on the team until we hear otherwise. I mean, the dude finished as the RB5 despite a fairly slow start and despite not scoring touchdowns really for the first 5 weeks of the season, partially just his own bad luck, partially because Jordan Love got hurt and that offense turned into a kind of gimmick for a month to kind of get by, which is what they had to do. After his bye week, though, he was 18 points or more in all but 1 game. Weeks 11 through 17, he was the RB2, 20.5 points per game. He tied for second in rushing touchdowns, and he's still just going to be 27. Like, he has a lot of carries, but he is still younger than people realize because he was like 20 when he got drafted. I'm not a Marshawn Lloyd believer. A.J. Dillon sucks. I don't care if he's back next year. We'll see if they add somebody else in that room, but just the way things stand right now, it's kind of shaping up for another big year for Josh Jacobs next year in this offense.
Yeah, I had him as an honorable mention. I don't really have a lot of negatives to say about him. I left him off the list because I don't know where he's going to end up, and I think that either Marshawn Lloyd becomes a player that impacts some of his usage, or they get somebody in that room. Just because I don't think they want him to be this 90% running back. But if you just look at his box score in weeks 1 through 3, he was the RB28. From 3 to 17, he became the RB5. Like, he really significantly stepped it up after those first 3 games. And part of that is the loss of Jordan Love for the second of those 2 games. And then he did play one of the best rush defenses in week 1 in the Philadelphia Eagles.
And they were also playing like on ice. It seemed
that was
like
a terrible field.
Think back to that game in Brazil.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this has nothing to do with it, but have you heard of the Josh Jacobs odd year?
No, but I do know, being a Josh Jacobs truther, that he does go like every other year is great. So I
Yeah.
believe
So
it.
even years, Josh Jacobs has produced a top 12 running back performance in every year. Odd years, he's finished outside of the top 30 running backs 3 times. So again, like it's not analysis or anything. I just saw the tweet and I was like, that is absolutely hilarious. We are obviously coming into an odd year. Could it be another bad year for Josh Jacobs? Even if it's like he rolls his ankle and doesn't play for 5 games or something.
Yeah, I mean that's Vegas. He did play every game this year, which is not a super common occurrence for Josh Jacobs.
No.
So that would definitely be a thing that could go wrong next year for sure. Okay, number 8 for you.
Number 8 for me was Omron, so I'll move to 7.
Okay.
I have Bijan Robinson here. So
Really?
yes.
He is number 2 overall for me.
Oh wow. I knew we were gonna have. I have 2 running backs above him. So far, in my opinion, it seems like Michael Penix is an improvement for this offense. It's really early for that to be like a statement that I'm going to continue to feel. But it's really hard to argue that no matter who's back there, Bijan Robinson is not really good. He's 4th among running backs in total opportunities this season, including rushes and receptions, and he has 63% of the team's red zone carries. There's still the off Tyler Algier appearances, but he really has solidified himself. He's 3rd among running backs in receptions, and there's no hiccup to his game that I'm going to sit here and critique. I just have him 7th here because it's Atlanta. I need to see a little more out of Atlanta. They should be good again next year, or at least be competitive. But those things are always current to change, and that's really about all the reason I have him there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Penix has shown me enough to where I see this being a very competent situation next year. How good remains to be seen, but I think it'll be a perfectly competent situation. You said it, 3rd in the NFL in receptions, and he is one of the few guys that can be 3rd in receptions, but also do it all between the tackles and on the goal line if you need him to. I think, for my money, he's probably the 2nd best running back in the NFL right now. I think you have to put Saquon 1 because he just had 2,000 yards rushing, but I think Bijan is probably 2 or maybe 3.
I can't believe we're going to disagree on who I have it for.
I think we can probably have a little bit more of a meta running back and receiver conversation in a minute as this unfolds. I did bring some stats from this year that we can talk about, but yeah, I just think like he's the RB4 this year. He's had, like a lot of these young guys, 3 straight games of 20 or more points. These have been 3 of his best 5 fantasy performances of his career in a row right here. Obviously, very short career, but the only issue is Tyler Algier. I don't think it's that big of an issue. I think Bijan is great. I have him at 2. I think the gist that I'm getting is I am going to be higher on running backs than you are in this top.
Yeah,
12.
I have 5 in my top 12. I'm assuming you have more.
I think mine is 6 and 6, but I wanted to get more. And I think like my top 3 are running backs, and I'm getting that. I'm feeling that your top, obviously, that yours.
My top 2 are wide receivers. So
bold after this year, wide receiver scoring is down. Dalton, haven't you heard?
yeah, and you zig when others zag.
Yeah, okay. Number 7 for me, I have Puka Nacua. I mean, he averaged 18 points per game, which would be wide receiver 2. He obviously missed about half the season, and I think that's really only one of 2 concerns that you can have with Puka, is he does have a pretty lengthy injury history at this point, going back to college, been banged up in the NFL a couple different times. And the other thing is Matthew Stafford is just old. Obviously, he has an injury history. Plays banged up a lot, whatever the case may be. Cooper Kupp, obviously, still a solid player, but kind of on the way down, on the way out. Puka Nacua, very, very good player. Like, he was unbelievable as a rookie. Took that, built on it, came back a better player, just was hurt a lot more this year than last year. And I think he is kind of, I don't want to say new Amon-Ra St. Brown because they're not like the same, but just like as far as consistency and just the confidence you feel when you have that guy in your lineup, I think he's in the same vein. He's just healthy a little less often. But I think the upside might be just a little bit more with Puka on a week-to-week basis than Amon-Ra right now.
So I had Puka Nacua at 2.
Okay.
And I figured this. I'm glad you at least put him in here so this didn't turn into a giant debate. But I did I started reading about Puka because I was like, I think I should at least consider him for the top 12. And then like the more I kept reading about Puka, the more I was like, I feel like this is a wide receiver who has been really good already and is actually like close to elite as like the best of the best in the NFL. So one thing that stood out to me, and this is from Nate Tice, you can look at it on Twitter. Since 2014, among a sample size of 2,047 pass catchers, Puka Nacua is first in successful targets route, first in explosive receptions route, and second in first downs route run. First downs route run is like a really indicative stat of how good a wide receiver is because obviously it moves the chains. But to be first in those categories, obviously he has a shortened career with injuries and only 2 seasons, is really impressive. The second thing I'll say about Puka is a fully healthy season for him. We were on pace for another Kingmaker Cooper Cup season that Matthew Stafford so often gives to his wide receiver ones. So the bet for me is, and probably will be all off season, is that if they both stay healthy, it's going to be one of those like seasons you talk about for a really long time with Puka Nacua. And like you said, if you take out the 1 week he got injured, which is week 1, and only take his healthy games, he finishes the wide receiver 2 for wide receivers with a minimum of 8 games between the weeks of 8 and 17. He just is so good with the ball in his hands, and he's so good for the type of play Matthew Stafford has. This offense had the second most offensive line rotations in the NFL because of injuries. I really think if the Rams get healthier next season and have a consistent offensive line, I mean, we're seeing it right now with how good they're playing football again. They're one of those teams you don't want to see in the playoffs right now.
Yeah.
That Puka Nacua could really, really quickly ascend himself into the Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson conversations on if he is on that elite tier. Obviously, the bugaboo you pointed out is going back to his time at BYU. The guy has a very long history of lower body injuries, and those are the ones that nag and can cause wide receiver seasons to go downhill fast.
Yeah, and I think really the main place you and I differ is just like he and Bijan basically averaged the same points per game last year, and I'm just going to take the running back over the receiver because I still think having that elite number 1 running back is more valuable in fantasy. It's a lot harder to fill in behind those guys.
And I think where I differ with you is I just think there's more meat on the bone for what Nacua can do. And I think Bijan's kind of like at his ceiling already with maybe a couple more tutties.
Oh, I disagree. I think Bijan could easily have a 2,000-yard season in his career. I mean, this is the next Saquon Barkley, like generational running back, right? He's shown us nothing on the field to make any, but like this is not a Marvin Harrison Jr. situation where it's like maybe he's
I have Ashton Gentry in my top 12.
Please don't get me started with that. Okay, number 6, I have CeeDee Lamb. Not too much to say here. It was a lost season for him, for the Cowboys. They lost Dak. Offense was devoid of weapons before that anyway. That hurt CeeDee's production a little bit. I don't want to act like I trust the Cowboys to make all the perfect moves and come back with the perfect offense, but I do think healthy quarterback, an offseason to retool. Like this was the wide receiver 1 in 2023. I think he's still deserving of mid first round this year.
Yeah, I have him at 6'2". It almost feels like I have to put him in the top 12 as a placeholder because we've seen what he can do.
If he ends up at like 1.9 or 1.10 in drafts, that's probably going to be one of my favorite picks next year.
Yeah, absolutely. It is one of the ones where like I did make myself almost put him in because I know he has to be in it.
Yeah.
And it's one of those ones where I feel like a lot of people, and I was doing this too, I could make a lot of arguments for guys I left out and putting them in over him based on where this franchise is heading for Dallas and based on the season he put up. But again, even with Cooper Rush, he finished as a top 6 wide receiver. He played 2 games with a shoulder injury that's caused him to be shut down. And you could see in the games the amount of pain it was causing him. Some of us playing against him in their semifinals was like, Dallas, what are you doing here? Just don't make him play. He still did. He still did really well.
So number 5, I have Justin Jefferson, and it's just like he's Justin Jefferson. His coach is very good. It doesn't matter if it's Sam Darnold, if it's the rookie now second year at this point, or if it's somebody like they're going to have a good passing attack until I see otherwise. And he is, I think, one of the 2 best receivers in the NFL right now. And you just think about all the hand-wringing and frustration that went on with JJ for about 3 weeks there, where he had like a stretch where he had 23 total points in 3 weeks. yet he still finishes with the most double-digit scoring games of any receiver. He's the wide receiver 2. And you look ahead to next year, I mean, Jordan Addison's not going to get the Rashid Rice suspension, but it sounds like probably about 3 games is what he's looking at. And that's already without any injury or anything. You're going to have Jordan Addison missing a couple of games, which, I mean, Justin Jefferson, I would think, would be pretty poised to take advantage in that spot.
Yeah, I have him here as well at 5. It was a down year for a lot of people's considerations of him. He was still the wide receiver 2. He only had 2 games in single-digit scoring. And this is one team where it doesn't matter to me who ends up playing under center for them, because Kevin O'Connell has shown that no matter if it's somebody off the road like Dobbs was last season, they're going to come in and they're going to get the ball to him and they're going to be a productive offense. Yep. So, yeah, no qualms with that. If it's JJ, if it's Sam Darnold, if it's Kirk Cousins, if it's God knows whoever comes in and QBs this team, Justin Jefferson's going to finish in the top 5 wide receivers, barring injuries.
Yep, 100%. Even if he gets injured, he still might do it because he's come close to doing that before. Number 4 for me, I have Jamar Chase. I had him number 1 as a receiver coming into last year. Shied away a little bit from that just because of when we had to put our ranks out and when drafts were happening. We were a little unsure of the contract situation, but he turned out to have his, I say, breakout year, but it's kind of his CeeDee Lamb year where he goes from being amazing to being the best at the position this year. I mean, he's going to get the triple crown this year. He has the most receptions by, I think, like 9. He has the most yards by like 140, and he has 4 more touchdowns than anybody else. He's amazing. The only thing you can really say about him is he is a little bit more up and down than you'd like, but also when you score like 50 points, 40 points multiple times, he just single-handedly will win you 2, 3, 4 games a year that you take the good with the 10-point games and you fight through it, because he right now I think is the best receiver in football.
Yeah, he's my 1. So
yeah, so I'm a little surprised. I think the 2 guys that are going to be battling for 1 will be Saquon and Bijan Robinson. So I'm a little surprised. I just like anytime we put a receiver 1, it just doesn't go well. I just don't think I think it's got to be
CMC was 1 almost all offseason.
Yeah, I don't mean like for the players, but I just mean like it just seems like we come back to next year. It's like, okay, we learned our lesson. Like running back is still kingmaker in fantasy football, and I kind of think that's where I'm at still. But yeah, I mean, like if you're gonna have him, I have number 1 overall as receiver. So if you're gonna put a receiver 1, I think it's him.
Yeah, that was pretty clear to me. Yeah, I think some other podcasts we'll have to hash out our differences on what we think this upcoming season will be on wide receiver versus running back. I think for me is there are a lot of guys that I couldn't rank at running back in the top 12 who I would be just as happy with to have in round 2. Where when you like, if you look at this season, round 2 wide receiver selections, like tank teams, you have Deebo Samuel, you have Chris Olave, you have Jalen Waddle. All of those were round 2 wide receivers. And sometimes, in my opinion, it's good to get like the one who's going to be there every week. And running back, you can sometimes re-engineer it. Bucky or Vig.
He also could have taken like T. Higgins in the 4th round and gotten a late 1st round value at receiver too. When he played, obviously when he played.
You could have taken Derrick Henry at the end of the 2nd round, gotten a 1st round running back. Yeah, Saquon Barkley was 3rd round pick last year, I think. 3rd or 2nd.
I think like late 2nd by the time we were actually drafting him. I definitely took him 2nd in my underdog draft and was like, what the hell? Like what? Why did I get him at 2-6? Okay, number 3 for you.
Number 4.
Number 4, sorry.
Yeah, so 1 and 2 are done for me. Jamar Chase, Puka Nacua. Okay. Number 4 for me is Jahmyr Gibbs.
He's my 3. So I have him higher than you, but lower on the running back, Rick.
Okay. So I labeled him, it's kind of a joke, but he's like the highest in handcuff that has ever existed in fantasy football.
Yeah, I mean, I told if David Montgomery just didn't exist, he'd be the 1-1 going into next year.
So like a fun stat, and part of the reason he's ranked over Bijan for me is that I think there's more upside to Jahmyr Gibbs still. Jahmyr Gibbs and Bijan Robinson over the last 2 seasons are separated by 3 PPR points. Yeah. Jahmyr Gibbs is the only player in the NFL to go over 70 scrimmage yards in every game this season. So even in games where David Montgomery is healthy, Jahmyr Gibbs is still producing at the most consistent floor of any running back. And
I would be curious. I don't have the stat. But my guess is if you looked at like 15 or 20-yard runs, if you looked at that stat, he would rank at or near the top this year specifically, but just in the last 2 years. And then when you rip off a 20-yard run basically every game, you're going to have a very safe like 80 to 90-yard floor at the running back position.
Yeah, and this is no discount to David Montgomery, who I think is a good football player.
Yeah, he should probably be a third-round pick next year.
Yeah, well, he's gotten worse. So over the last 2 seasons, this year, his yards per carry went down, his forced tackle rate went down, his broken tackle rate went down. This isn't me like saying Jahmyr Gibbs is going to come out and play 90% of their games because David Montgomery is cooked, but it is me saying like we now know exactly what it looks like when David Montgomery is not on the field, and it's 20-plus points every week for Jahmyr Gibbs. He did that for 3 straight weeks.
26, 24, 24 is what he's done the last 3 weeks, and that 26, I think Montgomery got hurt about halfway through that game.
Yes. So there is not like if you draft anybody else in the first round, there's no situation involving them that makes them better. Like there's no injury that's going to make them better. Jahmyr Gibbs is the one player where we still are missing like 30 to 40% of the fantasy points possible with the player. And that's why he's so high for me.
Which is crazy because he's the RB3 at the end of this year.
And obviously I'll just jump to my number 3 because I think he's your number 1. The only player I put above him was Saquon Barkley.
Yeah, Saquon's 1 for me.
Yeah. So I don't have a lot to say about Saquon Barkley. Incredibly good. Could have broken Eric Dickerson's record. He's not playing this week. He would have broken it on less carries for all those people who are like, yeah, but he's playing one more game. It would have been less carries, unless he got 40 carries and didn't reach 105 yards. And he'll do it with.
He just got like 37 carries to get 3,000 to get to 2,000 yards every day. So,
and he's playing the Giants, so I'm really concerned about. But he had 13 touchdowns. That's despite him being vultured at the 1-yard line by the most of any running back in the NFL. 9 times he was stopped within the 5-yard line and did not score a touchdown.
And he ranks in the bottom half of guys. It's a very small list of guys that have had 2,000 rushing yards. He's in the bottom half of rushing touchdowns. Yes. And yes, the tush push exists, but as you were saying, maybe he just falls down the one like 2 or 3 times less next year and has 17 touchdowns.
Well, and this is, I mean, he's taken himself out of 3 games this season. He said it himself when they were up. And it's behind a good offensive line. Like there aren't any holes that I can poke in Saquon Barkley other than he's a little older, but you can't poke that hole when he's had such a career year in both assets of the game. He's been a good pass catcher. He's been a good rusher.
Yeah. And he's entering like his age 28 season. So it's not quite like Derrick Henry where he's 31. He obviously has a little bit of injury history, but like, that's not really, you can't really, do much with that. Real quick, before we get too far away from Jahmyr Gibbs, I did want to say there are, I think, 2 holes you can poke with Jahmyr Gibbs. Number 1 is David Montgomery still there, still kind of holding down that every down workhorse potential for Gibbs. The second thing is what happens to this offense if Ben Johnson's not there anymore. I think that would be like the only very small concern for Gibbs, where like those are the 2 things for me that I that make Bijan be the very slight number 2 over the Jahmyr Gibbs number 3 in my mind. And yeah, I mean, with Saquon Barkley, I think it's really only 2 things. It's first, not very many guys have a number 1 season back-to-back years. I actually looked dating back to 2013. Can you guess the only player who's ever done it? I think we've had this conversation, but see it. Because I remember when I went back and looked, but I didn't.
Who's done what?
Who's had back-to-back RB1 seasons, like the RB1?
Is it Todd Gurley?
It is Todd Gurley, 2017 and 2018. And I was reminded of how freaking insane his 2017 playoff run, sorry about that, was when I went back and looked at this list. But CMC has gone number 1 and number 2 in back-to-back years. And other than that, no one's ever been really that close as far as like, oh, this guy was number 1 and then he was number 5. And like it's like just in the last 10 years that really hasn't happened. So it is a rarity. Part of that is because obviously it's hard to be the number 1. Part of that also might be it's taken Saquon 378 touches to get to this point. He still has probably multiple playoff games left to play, he could theoretically, if they make the Super Bowl, end up with like close to maybe like 480 touches this year.
We'll all see the stat because it rears its ugly head every season.
Yeah.
Running backs to have 350 or more touches in a season. I think only one player has repeated it, and that one player is Derrick Henry. To have an RB1 season the following season, I would say there's a lot of other things that go on in that. Generally, the team's really bad when running back gets that many touches. But yes, that stat will probably come up with Saquon. I think Saquon is one of those players where you have to shrug your shoulders and say, he hurdled a guy backwards. I'm sorry. Like your stats don't apply here, nerd. Like,
no, I agree. And like, I've not that either of us have been out on Saquon, but I think I have been a little bit more in. Like when he was with the Giants, I was more willing to take the plunge than you were. So you don't have to convince me as far as like how great of a player he is. I think he's finally just got the perfect situation to show it this year. And just thinking about that, I don't see why next year is going to be any different. There's nobody who they're going to bring at running back who you're going to be like, oh man, like he's going to be pushed for touches. Like, no, it's going to be Saquon's backfield, and Saquon's backfield mostly alone next year. Whether it's I think Camp Gamwell's a pretty, I'd say not good, like solid, very solid NFL running back, and he is just a complete afterthought. Whereas on 26 other teams, he'd be getting 100 touches probably. Like he's that quality of player, I think. O-line is just always good, pretty much in Philly, it seems. Maybe injuries could change that, but there's nothing on paper that will make us feel differently heading into next year. And then, like, Jalen Hurts has had a very good bounce back year. This offense had a very good bounce back year after the way things finished last year. And I don't see myself feeling any worse than I felt about this offense entering this season. And I wasn't feeling terrible, but I wasn't feeling great. I think I'll be feeling pretty good about where things are at with this offense as a whole. Health pending, obviously, for this team.
Yeah, and you'll notice he's an honorable mention for me. I don't know if he was for you. AJ Brown didn't make either of our top 12s this year. And part of that is because they have been able to run the ball so effectively that his volume declined back to Tennessee.
When your running back rushes for 2,000 yards, it's really hard for the receiver to also be like the wide receiver 4.
Especially when there's a second wide receiver on that team who's also very good.
Yeah, especially when Devonta Smith exists. And also, other teams occasionally have 1-yard passing touchdowns to their best receiver. The Eagles never have 1-yard passing touchdowns, period.
Well, they did when Kenny Pickett was in. AJ Brown did have one of those. But yes, when Jalen Hurts in, it doesn't happen.
Yeah. So, I think we're on the same page there. Real quick before we get out of here, I just thought this would be just kind of interesting context to tie the whole conversation together. Receivers versus quarterback, etc. It's like, it's funny. So what I was going to say, and I'm not surprised that you have more receivers than me because it's kind of how we usually roll. But for me, I have 6 receivers, and I was kind of like, man, like, is that too many? Should I have Devon Achane? Like we haven't mentioned Chase Brown on the show. We have off the show. Like, should he be a guy we think about? Just looking at the drop off in averages, and this is only like I haven't gone back and looked at multiple years. You don't want to say, oh, this happened last year and this happened this year, so that means this will happen again next year. That's not what I'm saying. But last year, the top 10 scores at wide receiver averaged about 16 points per game. This year, that was down to 14.5 points per game. You look at the running back position. Last year, running backs averaged 15.8 points per game. The guys in the top 10, and which at receiver, it was 15.9, so almost identical. So you go from 15.9 to 15.8. Now, this year, at running back, it was 17.1 points per game among the top 10. This year, again, 14.5. So we're about 2.5, I think 2.6 exactly, points off of the top 10. You look at receiver versus running back. And at running back, that's leaving out Joe Mixon, who did not qualify as a top 10 running back, but did average 17 points per game. He just obviously missed some time. So I don't know if that is something that will continue. I do think there are probably reasons you can point to at receiver for why that's happening. I'd be curious, I guess, to hear your kind of off the cuff take. But I just think you just see so many more 3 receiver sets. You see so many where it's just so hard to predict week over week at receiver. Like guys, the guys you expect mostly end up like cumulatively being and like the elite of the elite guys. They're pretty consistent, but like the wide receiver 11, it may be a bumpy ride, but he ends up the wide receiver 11. It's mostly kind of who you thought was going to be, with some exceptions, obviously, like Jerry Jeudy. It's not somebody we thought would be in that conversation. But to me, I just think it's maybe just more of a spread out target share. I'm not sure if you have a take ready to go on that though.
I do have some thoughts I'll talk about, and I think this would be a good full discussion for us in the offseason. The first thing I'll say is we had an outlier season for running backs not getting injured, and an outlier season for the number of wide receiver ones that got injured. So you have Nico Collins, who missed a season or missed 4 games. You have Chris Godwin, who was pacing to be a wide receiver 2, got injured. Mike Evans, who finished the season as wide receiver 3, missed 5 games. You have
wide receiver 3 in points per game, I'm sure.
Points per game, yes.
Yeah.
You have AJ Brown, who missed multiple games. So that's the first problem, is a lot of the top end wide receiver talents missed games. My second thing here is not a lot of the top end running backs missed it. Like the old heads that a lot of people were out on didn't miss games, and they became the top running backs in the NFL. And the second thing is the NFL, it has a trend. And I know you do, but to our listeners, if you listen to the Athletic Football Show, they really do a good job at identifying these. For several years, the NFL became really pass happy, and then defenses adjusted and put up cover 2. And right now, I think we're in a trend where offenses are adjusting to that. And because spend is so low on players like linebackers, which are really effective for stopping the run, but not so effective in passing situations, teams have been able to go back to running the ball as being an effective measure. I mean, there's no better golden child to look at this than what the Kansas City Chiefs have done. They went from an electric pass heavy offense to we'll run it for 5 yards every play and kill you in the game that way. And the NFL is going to adjust again. Right now, the offenses have adjusted. There's going to be, I would say, the next 1 to 2 seasons, a readjustment back to playing less cover 2 coverages. That's going to reinvigorate the passing game, and it just shifts back and forth. So those are the off the cuff thoughts I have, is that at one point we're going to see a lot more nickel base formations again in the NFL, and that's going to lead us back to this pass haven. Oh, and the last player I didn't mention, Puka Nacua might have broken records had he played a full season. So I think there's 5 or 6 wide receivers that didn't play full seasons, and because of that, the scoring does get a little tilted. And the very, very last thing I'll say is we had 5 rookie quarterbacks in the NFL, and then we had, I think, 5 or 6 teams change quarterback play callers throughout the season. And that's always going to affect your pass effectiveness in the NFL. And maybe if Drake May had one of these good wide receivers, we'd be talking a little differently about the scoring outputs.
Don't let that be T. Higgins, please. Okay, I think that is a good conversation for us to have at a later point. Glad we could at least kind of just get a little preview, because I did think that was interesting when I went and looked at how things worked out this year. Dalton, football game is tied. That means that is going to do it for episode 166 of the Half Point Per Podcast. Thank you all so much for listening. Give us a follow, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Half Point Per Pod. Subscribe to the YouTube. The link to all those things will be in the show notes. As always, we'll have weekly shows through the playoffs, I suspect, will probably be the plan. And then we'll have shows throughout the offseason as well. We'll keep you updated on that as updates are available. Of course, the show is available anywhere you listen to podcasts, Spotify, Apple, all of that. Leave us a 5-star review, and we will talk to you again next week.